Today I'm going to discuss first the application of functional integral method and path integral methods to fermions, because up to now the last 2 weeks have been devoted to quantization and renormalization of a theory involving the simplest of all kind of quantum field, that is the quantum field associated to massless particles, the scalar field. And of course we know that in fact the universe contains many more complicated particles, in particular fermions that with spin 1/2, and vector field particles with spin 1. And there are, in fact, it's only very recently that we have really discovered a scalar particle, the Higgs particle. Okay. So, but fermions causes some problems. There are some subtleties associated with fermions that I'm going to discuss when you are using path integral methods. So first, let me just, to fix the notation, remind you that fermions appear thanks to, well, both experimental physics in the 20s, but of course thanks to Adrien Dirac, Paul Adrien Dirac. And let me just, to fix the notation, remind what the Dirac equation is. So the Dirac equation involves first, of course, those famous Dirac matrices, the Dirac algebra that are used to represent, to do a representation of the rotation group, of the Lorentz group, for particles with spin 1/2. So first, remember, first Diracology. So Diracology, very standard. We know that we have Dirac matrices with mu going from 1 to 4. I stay in 4 dimensions. And these are, in fact, 2 to the n, so that's times, so the integer part of 2 to the n matrices. And they obey the famous Dirac anti-commutation relation. Gamma mu, I put brackets to indicate that this is anti-commuting relation. This is gamma mu minus gamma mu. And this is proportional to the metric tensor. So remember, I am in the I'm still using the minus plus signature. So with this signature, the anti-commutation relation for the Dirac matrices are minus 2 times. Yes? Pardon? Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Really? Of course. This is the anti-commutation. And with this matrices, we have the wave function of the electron, of the Dirac particle, is described by a field psi, which has in fact a components. Oh, n is a dimension of space here, so I should denote this d. Okay, and the Dirac equation is in covariant notation I d slash of psi minus of psi equals 0, with of course d slash equal gamma mu d mu. Okay, so this is Dirac equation. And I think, I don't know if you have seen that in QFT1 course. In fact, we can write the Dirac equation as deriving from some Dirac action. Okay, so if you can write an action S that will depend both on psi and on its conjugate, and the conjugate of psi will be simply well, at that stage, I don't need to precise it. Let me write something which is simply d4x psi bar of x times I d slash minus m psi of x. Okay, well, yes? Pardon? Oh, it's d over 2. I'm sorry. This is d over 2. Very sorry. Hard. Pardon?
The components of psi as well, d over 2.
This?
The components of psi, away from
2 to the d over 2. I'm sorry. This is n, let us say, n. I'm sorry. Not really awoken. So, of course, in 4 dimensions, this gives 2 to the power 2, which is 4, which is the result. In d equals 3, this is 2. That's enough. In 2 for d equals 2, this is 2. I'm sorry. Okay. So, in fact, and I think that if I'm not mistaken, well, gamma bar is related to the complex conjugate of psi by something that I will explain a bit later. So, but take this action as something depending on psi bar and psi, and take the derivative of this action, which is just a quadratic form with respect to psi bar, and you get, of course, the Dirac equation. Okay. And so there is some classical action, and if you take the functional derivative, the equation of motion of this classical action, you get the Dirac equation. So you may ask, why not quantize, use functional integral? As we did for the scalar field, and that as we shall do tomorrow for the gauge field. And the problem is related to the anti-commutation relation, because as you have seen in QFT1 course, I hope, in QFT1, you have seen that when performing the second quantization of the Dirac equation to study a quantum field theory of Dirac particles, performing second quantization means basically that you associate to the wave function a field operator. So second quantization means that now psi of x and psi dagger of x will become field operators. Operators acting on the Fock space of the fermions. States with an arbitrary number of fermionic states, okay, of fermions. And then, of course, the problem is that the field operator obeys anti-commutation relation even if they are at spatially separated. So if you take 2 points in space-time, x1 and x2 in space-time, that are spatially separated, instead of having a commutation relation like using the field operators at 2 different points, you get anti-commutation relation then you have an additional term if they are at the same point. This is the way to generate the Fock space, but they anti-commute. That's a way to express that what's happening or what you are measuring here doesn't influence what you are going to do here. That's causality. This comes from causality and locality. And therefore, using a functional integrals treating just psi and psi bar, or rather the component of psi and psi bar, as we did for the bosonic, the path integral or the functional integral for the boson, will not work. Okay. But of course, well, we need to, if we are going to quantize our theory using a path integral formalism, we need to treat on the same footing fermionic and bosonic fields. So one needs a device to perform a functional integral for the Dirac field. And that's what I'm going to explain. This is this method of functional integral for fermions were in fact invented, I think, mostly by a Russian mathematical physicist and a mathematician called Berezin. Okay. And it's something that we shall need, not only for quantizing the Dirac equation, but it's also an important piece of the quantization of gauge theories, because in gauge theories, you probably have already heard about the fact that you need to introduce ghost field, ghosts that obey the Fermi statistic, although they are spinless. So this comes from the Fermi, of course, Fermi-Dirac statistics. And so that's an important feature, an important tool also for the quantization of non-abelian gauge theories. Okay? And Berezin calculus relies on something that I presume you have seen already in the front-end course, that is Grassmann variables and Grassmann calculus, calculating using numbers, in quotes, that are anti-commutes instead of commutes as the ordinary real or complex numbers. Okay. So let me just first, for notation, recall what are those rules of what is called Grassmann algebra. Okay. So a Grassmann algebra is the algebra generated by objects that anti-commutator. So I will consider a Grassmann algebra that I would denote Gn, or sometimes it's also called lambda n because it's related to, well, in fact, it's exactly the same kind of algebra that the algebra that mathematician denotes by exterior algebra. That's the same thing. So let me consider a dimension n. So it would be an algebra over C or R. Well, mathematicians, of course, develop them on general fields, but n-dimensional. It will be well, the algebra will be generated by in the case of C, by 2n anti-commuting generators. So let me call them just theta I and theta bar I equal 1 from n. Okay, so at the moment those are just mathematical object. Okay? And this, we define a multiplication between those numbers. Since it's an algebra means that you can add and multiply those algebra. First, you can multiply those generators by complex numbers. I'll come to that later. But you can multiply them. And basically, the idea is that if you multiply some theta g by some theta I, or some, they're anticommutes. And the same for thetas and theta bars, and theta bars and theta bars. So everything commutes. Theta I, theta bar g plus theta bar g, theta I equals 0, etc. Okay. So in particular, this means that if you take the same this is equal to 0. So those elements are nilpotent. That's what mathematicians say. When you multiply something by itself, it gives 0, it's nilpotent. There are nilpotent matrices, those are nilpotent generators. Okay? And of course, the same for, so theta I squared equals theta bar I squared equals 0. Okay? So these are the generators. So here I have 2n generators. I will explain a bit later why I separate them into n and n different. That's because I will deal with a structure on C. So those will be the complex conjugate of those. Okay. And so now the elements of the algebra is so this is the algebra generated by 2n. So a general element of the algebra, a general element of the algebra, that's Gn, that we call G. This is simply the sum over all the possible terms. So it can be written as C, just a complex number, plus, let us say C1, 0, theta, what, I, Ci theta I, plus Ci bar theta bar I, plus Ci G bar theta I theta G bar G, etc. So you can write them by all. So these are complex numbers. You use the fact that they anticommute to write only the possible terms. So of course, if you add theta I and theta bar G, so you write always all the theta to the left of the theta bar. That's a convention. So the general term will be a C, some C times theta I1 theta ik times theta bar G1 theta bar gk, or gh, let us say. You see, because you may have a different number of thetas and theta bars. And using the anticommutation relation, you can always assume that I1 is less than I2 less than ik, and that G1 is less than G2 less than GH. Okay, and you have some C depending on the choice of those I's, let us say, of the I's and of the G, a complex number. Okay. Yes.
Is there a reason if the coefficients of the theta I and theta I bar are the same? Are they meant to be the same?
No. That's why I should have written an I bar. So yes, of course. So it's better write it that way. Well, that's not the way I wrote them, but that's perhaps a good idea. To write them G and G bar, to be sure what you are doing. Those are just, of course, integers. It's just label, okay? Yeah, it could be a good idea. Okay? And so you see immediately that this is a form of general element. So this is just this algebra is a vector space generated by those 2n elements. So of course, Gn has a dimension. This algebra has a dimension. Well, here it will have dimension 2 to the power 2n. No, 2 to the power, yes. Okay? Because you may have 2 to the power 2n possible different terms. And of course, this is an algebra, so it means that you can add them if you have addition. You can have G1 plus G2. Well, adding G1 plus G2 means simply adding the coefficients for the different terms. But, and you have multiplication. And in order to compute G1 plus G2, you simply have to take G1, to take G2, and use the anti-commutation rules to put all the thetas to the left, all the theta bars to the right, and ordered in the possible way. Okay? So you just use the anti-commutation rule. Okay? And, well, I don't think I have an example here, but I think you have seen that. But for instance, let us consider the case n equal 1. Example, n equal 1. So you have only one theta and one theta bar. So a general G is of the form A plus, well, let me write that simply. B times theta plus B bar, well, plus C times theta bar plus D times theta bar. And if I have G1, B1, C1, D1, and G2 equal A2 plus B2 theta plus C2 theta bar plus D2 theta bar, then G1, G2 is equal of, so you do the calculation. This is A1, A2. Then so you have a term proportional to theta, which is A1, B2 plus A2, B1 theta. Well, that's a simple pair. A1, C1, C2 plus A2, C1 theta bar. And then you have to take into account the products of thetas and theta bars. And you see that if you multiply this term with this term, it gives 0 because you have a theta squared. But if you multiply this term by these terms, you have a theta bar. So you have a theta bar. So you have a theta bar terms that will contain many terms. It will first contain A2D1, A1 D2, then it contains B1 C2, and then it contains B2 C1, but with a minus signs because theta bar is to the left of theta, and you use the anti-commutation relation. So you get minus B2 C1. Okay. And you may check that if you compute G1 squared, you will have something which is non-zero. So in general, in this algebra, the general element of the algebra neither commute nor anti-commute. Okay. But this algebra is what is called a Z2 graded algebra, or what sometimes is called the superalgebra. It's important in supersymmetric theories because you can check that in general you have elements that have an even number of thetas and theta bars and elements that have an odd number. So you can write the algebra G in some sense as a direct product of as a direct sum of elements that contains an even number of thetas and theta bars. So here are the this is G even and the odds. Okay, and the elements in G even, in fact, form an algebra, and they are still even. So this is a commutative. This is a commutative algebra. No, I'm sorry. This is no. It cannot. No. This is a commutative. So they commute. The element of the G odd, if you multiply two elements of G odd, they belong to G even. Okay. So you see, so even times even gives even, and odd times odd times even, but of course even times odd is odd, etc. So this is the fact that you can associate to some of the element a grading, which is either even or odd, or if you prefer plus and minus 1, is preserved, well, in a natural way by multiplication. Okay, so that's what is called a graded algebra. Okay. So if you have a complicated element, in fact, you do not need generally to make the calculation to see whether they commute or anti-commute. You just count if they contains only an even number or an odd number of thetas. And if they are a sum of those terms, you separate into those terms and you can compute directly the product. Okay. Good. So now, since I'm considering an algebra over C, an algebra over C, but in fact it's true also for an algebra over R, I need to define what is if there is something that corresponds to this theta bar. So I will need to define a conjugation operation. Let me call it a Grassmann conjugation. Well, you see, it's a denomination that is perhaps not completely standard, but I use it. So conjugation is just the analog of the standard conjugation for complex number, or of transposition for matrices, or Hermitian conjugation for complex matrices. Okay. So to any element G, I associate a conjugate G star. Okay? And that's defined by the following rules. For a complex number, C star will be simply the complex conjugate of C. Ordinary complex conjugation. Complex conjugation. Okay. For theta I, so just the generators, theta I star will be equal to theta I, and to theta bar I, so that will be, and theta bar I star will be theta I. Okay, so that's just generalization, extension of. So it's, or if you prefer, it's like Z and Z bar. So set that Z star equal Z bar and Z bar star equal Z for complex number. But here is generator, so it's rather like dz equal dz bar and dz bar equal dz. Okay, and finally, for a general element, we need to know what the conjugation is doing on the product. And the rule is that G1, G2 star, so the conjugation of the product is a transpose of the product of the two matrices. So it's exactly like for matrices and for real matrices, or M goes to M Hermitian conjugate for complex matrices. Okay. And so with those rules, this is sufficient and this is consistent. But you see, for instance, that in our case of n equal 1, G star is A bar plus C bar theta plus B bar theta bar minus D theta theta bar. No, I'm sorry, plus. Yes, minus theta theta bar, because the complex conjugate of, and D bar, because the complex conjugate of theta theta bar, oh no, that's plus. Because the conjugate of theta theta bar is theta bar, which is theta times theta bar. Okay. Good. Yes. But that's a peculiarity of what's going on for n equal 1. For n equal 2, then you have signs. So in general, you have signs. In general, if you have theta I1 up to theta Ik, then theta bar G1 up to theta bar GH, let's say, and you take its complex conjugate, this will be, first it will be theta G1, theta GH times theta bar I1 up to theta bar Ik, but there will be a minus sign that will be, in fact, the minus the integer part of the number of thetas plus the integer part of the number of theta bars. So in general, there is a sign. Okay? Good. So these are the rules that define what is this algebra, this exterior algebra or this Grassmann algebra over these. Okay, but now what's new? So this object was known since the beginning of the 20th century, I think. What's new and what Berezin brought was rules of derivation and integration. And Gn. Okay. So let me just give them. If you have an element of the algebra, you can view it in some very loose sense as a function of the thetas and the theta bars, because you can view that as a Taylor expansion of G in thetas and theta bar. But of course, it's not a function of the thetas and the theta bars. The thetas and the theta bars are just generators. And if you view that, you can say, okay, can I derive with respect to one of the theta or integrate with respect to one of the theta to obtain a function, a different function. Okay. So, how is the derivation? I define a derivation in the standard way by saying that if I have, I take the derivation with respect of theta of a complex number, this is 0. And if I take a derivative of theta with respect to theta I, this will be 1. And in general, I will say that this is 0 if theta g is different from theta I. Okay? Same thing for derivative with respect to theta bar. Bar I of theta bar g equal delta ig. Then, of course, I would like to have that d over d theta I of theta bar g equals 0, and d over theta bar I of theta g is equal to 0. Okay? So that's okay for deriving this element, this element, this element. And for deriving an element that contains a bunch of thetas and theta bar, the rule is simply two more rules. We want that the derivatives anti-commutes, and we want that if we want to compute what is d over d theta I of some products of theta, just write it A1, well, I1 up to Ik. Well, either there is no theta I, then this is 0, or there is a theta I, there is this theta I somewhere, then the rule is bring the theta I to the left, and apply this rule. And of course, when you are doing that, you get a sign. So what you get is that you get theta I1 with theta I removed, theta Ik, with a sign which is basically -1 times the number of thetas, number of i's A less than I. The number of i's there that were to the left. So things to start to become a bit complicated. And the same for theta bar. Okay. So for instance, in this case, well, d over d theta of g, example, n equal 1, d over d theta of g is, this one here. This is b, d over d, but d over d, I'm sorry, this is b plus d1 theta, plus d theta bar, if g is a plus b theta plus c theta bar plus d theta bar. But d over d theta bar of g is c minus d theta, because you have to, you see the rules. Okay? And this derivative anti-commute. So from this definition, you can check that if you apply it twice, d over some d theta 1 d theta I, d theta g is always equal to 0. Well, idem for the d over d theta bar, and when performing computing the anti-commutator over d theta and d over d theta bar. So all these derivative anti-commutes instead of commuting. Okay. So this is for derivation. And now, for integration, we want to have an operation that to a given G tells me what is the integral of G with respect to theta I. So G is in fact is a linear combination of products of theta and theta bar, and I want to integrate over one of the theta. So what does it mean? Well, we just have to define an integration that satisfies the integration by part rule. Yes?
When we define the derivative like this,
yes?
does it satisfy Leibniz rule?
It should, I think. I never asked that question. That's a good question.
Only one of the
yes. Yes.
So.
Yes. So in some sense, it's trivial, I would say. It defines it in a. Well, this is what it is. Okay, so let's go back to integration. Integration, I just want to have something like the integration by parts. So I want to have that when I integrate with respect to one generator, the derivative with respect to one generator, I want this to be a boundary terms. But I'm integrating in some abstract space of functions, so it has no boundary. So I want to have this to be always equal to 0. So the rule is that. The thetas can be viewed as coordinates in a space of anti-commuting coordinates that has no boundary, because you have no representation, geometrical representation of what it is. Okay. And then there is a very simple relation, a solution to that. In fact, that I think is basically the only solution. The solution is simply take by definition integral over d theta I to be equal to d over d theta. Why does it work? Because in fact, if you take, because since derivative anti-commute, they are nilpotent. If you take the second derivative of any function with respect to one variable, it gives 0. Therefore, this is automatically satisfied. Yes. So it's a bit strange definition, but it works very well. And of course, the same thing for d theta bar I. Well, again, those integration will anti-commute. You see also that if you have a function g that is a linear combination of the thetas and the theta bar, its integral with respect of theta I doesn't contain any theta I anymore, since it contains at most one theta I and you take a derivative. So it's a function of, it's not a function of this theta I. So that's what we expect from an integration. You have a function that is depends on several variables. With respect, you integrate with respect to one variable, so you get a function that depends only on the remaining variable. Okay, so it has a nice of. But you see that there are some strange things. For instance, if you compute the integrals of the constant function, this gives 0, since it's the derivative of 0. And if you integrate theta I, you get 1. So basically, that's what you need to know. So I think you have seen that before. Oops. And now, of course, these rules of calculation are useful because you can perform integrals over Gaussian. So we can perform Berezin integrals over Gaussians and recover a fermionic version of the Wick theorem. So that's why this mathematically a bit involved construction is very useful. So now, let me consider in this algebra Gn, where I have n theta i's and n theta bar i's, let me consider the following element of the algebra, which is just the exponential of a quadratic form. So I take E to be equal to exponential of minus theta bar I, aig, theta g, with aig some n by n matrix. And let me take it to be self-adjoint. Okay. You can define that for a general matrix, but you can see that if you construct use the anti-commutation relation, only the antisymmetric, the Hermitian part of A subset. So how do we find the exponential? Well, you define simply the exponential of, some matrix G as 1 plus G plus 1 over 2 G squared plus etc. If G belongs to your algebra. And of course, since we are dealing with an object generated containing anti-commuting variables, if G contains thetas and theta bars, you check very easily that this ends up, this sum ends at order n for this form, for G equal this, for G equal theta bar I, aig, theta g. Because if you have a product of more than n times this quadratic form, you are necessarily 2 times the same theta. You see? At order m larger than n, necessarily some theta I squared, at least, that are equal to 0. You see? Good. So this is in fact a polynomial in E, and so this is a polynomial in this, and once you have a polynomial in the thetas and the theta bar, well, you apply the anti-commutation rule to have all the thetas and all the theta to the left of the theta bar. Okay? So for instance, in well, you have to compute a little bit more, but for instance, examples. If you have n equal 1, exponential of minus theta a theta bar is just 1 plus a theta theta bar. If you have exponential of minus for n equal 2, it's a bit more complicated. Yes?
Your matrix A is, the elements are just complex numbers?
Pardon?
Your matrix, the matrix's components are just complex numbers, right?
The A are complex number, complex matrix. So this is an element of the algebra of grade even. Yes.
Take the case of n equals to 1. Instead of being 1 plus a, shouldn't it be 1 minus a theta theta?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's because I had the theta bar. I'm sorry. Thank you. That was a mistake. That's because my convention has the theta bars to the right of the thetas. Okay. So for n equal 2, I get this. For n equal 2, you get, well, you get something a bit more complicated. Because you get exponential of, for n equal 2, I have theta 1 and theta 2, theta bar 1, theta bar 2, and exponential of minus theta bar I, aig, theta g. If you compute it correctly, it starts by 1. And what is interesting is the last term, the term that contains theta 1, theta 2, theta bar 1, theta bar 2. That's the term that has the highest degree. Because you found that it is A12, A21 minus A11, A22. Okay? And then, when you integrate a Gaussian, if you perform a Gaussian integration, integral d theta, so let me write that in the way. I make a product. One has to be careful about the order of integration. So let me perform. I take the products of the integral d theta bar I, d theta I, from I equal 1 to n. So this means that I'm integrating over d theta. First, I'm integrating over d theta 1, then over d theta bar 1, then over d theta 2, then over d theta bar 2, etc., etc. So be careful ordering. This is integral, or if you prefer, that's not important. This is integral d theta bar 1, d theta 1, integral d theta bar 2, integral d theta 2, etc. Okay, of exponential of this quadratic form, minus theta bar I, aig, theta g. Well, you pick up only the term with highest degree. Because all the other one, there is some theta missing, and if you integrate over some of the thetas and the theta bar and they are missing, you get 0. So you get only term of highest degree. And this is this term. And you see that this, in fact, if you compute correctly, since I first integrate over theta 2, I have to bring the theta 2 to the left. Then I integrate over theta bar 2, so I have to integrate. Then I integrate over theta 1, then I integrate over theta bar 1. If you count 12, this gives the sign -1. So you get A11, A22 minus A12, A21. So, term of highest degrees with signs. And it is easy to check that this is nothing but the determinant of the matrix. And that's the main results we are going to use. Okay, yes?
When you make the expansion of the exponential, you should have a 1 over n factorial, right? So
yes.
This implies that the switching of signs will fix that n.
Yes, but if you count how you may, there are two ways. There is indeed a 1 over factorial, but if you count what is 1/2 of theta bar 1A 1 theta bar theta 1 plus theta bar 1A 1 2 theta 2 plus theta 1A I'm sorry, plus theta bar 2 A 2 1 theta 1 plus theta bar 2 A 2 2 theta 2 squared. You see that in order to have a term containing 1 theta 1, 1 theta 2, 1 theta bar 1, 1 theta bar 2, you can take this one and this one. You can take this one times this one, but in all cases, these are non-diagonal terms. You have two ways. So the factor 1 over 2 disappears. That's the idea. Well, this is a bit of an just a combinational proof, but you can prove that it's general. Okay. Because of course, if you take the square of this term, it will give 0 because it contains 2 theta 1. Okay. Good. So this is the main results. Gaussian integration over complex, over exponential in a complex Grassmann algebra just gives the determinant. Okay? And that's something that is different from the bosonic case. If instead of taking thetas and theta bar, we are using ordinary complex number, what we would be computing is dz bar products over I exponential minus z bar I aig the I. I'm integrating over the complex plane, and this is up to some unimportant 2 pi factor that in fact has to be contained in the definition of the measure. This gives you 1 over the determinant of A for complex. Okay. And finally, so this is a Gaussian integration. And finally, if you now try to compute the same thing by computing fermionic expectation value, using these Gaussian integrals, well, basically, what is the expectation value of some element of the algebra? This is simply the integral over those theta, d theta bar d theta, products from I equal 1 to n, of exponential of minus theta bar I aig theta g times g, normalized by, so divided by okay. So this is a definition, if you want, of an expectation value. And well, you might be annoyed because I am dividing something which is a priori in an algebra that is a multiplicative algebra, but it's not what is called the division algebra. It doesn't have a division. All the elements are not divisible by something. But remember, if you are integrating over all the elements, you always get a complex number. So this is a complex number. Complex number. Divided by another complex number. So you are fine. Okay. And then you can do again the calculation. Well, what do you do? So of course, it's easy to see that if you compute the expectation value of an odd number of thetas, you will get 0. That's basically because this involves an even number. Okay. But now what is interesting is what's happening when you compute the expectation value of a product of a theta and a theta bar. Okay? Because let us do that in this simple example. N equal 1. In the n equal 1 case, I am computing integral d theta bar. No, d theta bar d theta of 1 plus a let me be sure of my notation. Theta bar times theta bar divided by integral d theta bar d theta 1 plus a theta bar. We have seen that the denominator is a, well, the numerators give you 1. So this is the inverse of the kernel. Well, if you work a little bit, you see that if you have 1 theta and 1 theta bar, you will have the products of aij for pairs of thetas and theta bars that do not contain the theta I here and the theta bar g here, with minus signs depending on the permutation. So you will have a product. So what you will have going is you have a product, a sum over products of a for n minus 1 pairs that do not contain I and g with signs. Okay, and at the numerator, and you discover that this is simply the minor ig of A. So the determinant of the matrix A when you remove the line I and the column G, divided by the determinant of A. So this is nothing but, in fact, the inverse, the element Ig of the inverse of the matrix. And that's something similar to what we have for Gaussian integration. Remember, for Gaussian integration, what we have is that the expectation value of Zi, Z bar G, is A minus 1 of Ig. This is Wick's theorem. Yes?
One thing, so when you define the differentiation on the integration like that,
yes,
or integration like this, then, for example, if I want to make a change of variables inside the integral,
yes,
does that follow the usual rules?
This follows the usual rule, but you have to be you have to make fermionic change of variables. So you have to make change of variables that involves anti-commuting generators. I think that's something you saw a bit in the front-end course. Yeah, because if you start to mix commuting and anti-commuting variables, then you are a bit in trouble. But basically, it follows the same rule. For change of variables, no, I am not completely sure. No, I think you can do something like that. You can change theta I into, let us say, theta prime I equal some matrix MIG theta I. And then you will have integral over d theta prime I, of course, and the same for the theta bar. I think that this will be theta bar, theta I, but you will have the determinant. So you will have a Jacobian. So we have the determinant of M. You will have to the power squared because you have the 2, but I think you have the opposite sign than what you have in exactly for the same reason. You have the opposite sign of what you have for the bosonic case, for the usual reason. Well, for the reason that the integration is the same thing as the differentiation, and the differentiation, when you change a variable in differentiation, we get a Jacobian that is the inverse for integration. Okay. So, the basic rule that you need to know is this. So you have the same result than for Gaussian integration, but beware, if I take the expectation value of the products of the theta bar with the theta g, of course, since they anti-commute, what I will get is minus so you see that when you compute something which is a formal expectation value of the thetas and the theta bars in an Gaussian integral of the thetas and the theta bar, well, you see that they anti-commute, as they should from their definition. Okay. And now, here is the beautiful things. If you work a little bit more, and this requires introducing generating functions with the source term that anti-commutes, you end up with the 4-point expectation value or the 4-point function. If you do that, you get that if I take the expectation value of 1 theta I, 1 theta bar G, 1 theta K, 1 theta bar L, if I am careful enough, then I will have 2 A that disappears, so you have a product of 2 minors. And finally, you end up with A minus 1 IG, A minus 1 KL, then you have A minus 1 IL, A minus 1 KG, and then you have A, and that's it. And you get a minus sign here. Yes?
The last red box, shouldn't the indices of the matrix be switched?
Of the?
Of the matrix. The matrix element shouldn't be JI instead of IG.
No, because here I put I inverted. No, that's correct. Remember, A is a Hermitian. So, well, this is minus theta g theta bar I. So this is A minus 1. Oh, no, you're right. Yes, no, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Yes, you are right. It goes from G to I. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, full mistake. Okay, so you get this with a plus sign and this with a minus sign. This just comes from the anti-commutation. And therefore, this means that, in fact, this is exactly what you expect from the Wick theorem. Because you see that you can represent a propagator like just an expectation value as a line going from I to G. Okay? And this means that theta I is to the left of theta bar G. And then this means that when I'm interested in something where you have I, G, K, and L, I'm computing a 4-point function. What I get is IG times KL minus IL times kg. So this is exactly the diagrammatic representation of the Wick theorem for fermions, for fermionic operator, for fermionic creation, or fermions creation, and annihilation operators. So those quite abstract rules of calculation, where we have introduced those strange commuting and anti-commuting generators. We have defined rules of calculation, of integration and derivation. Then you end up by, when you are considering expectation value obtained from Gaussian integration of those objects, obtained by these Berezin calculation rules, then what you get is just the form of the Wick theorem from propagator creation and annihilation operator and correlation function. So that's what we need. That's what we are looking for. We are looking for something where we can create operators that anti-commutes instead of commuting. So once we have defined this a bit, abstract rules, we can just apply them. You said those are the recipes for performing a path integrals over fermions. And so let us just go back to the Dirac field. So what you have to do is that you have now to treat the Dirac fields that I was defined formally here again, psi, which is the data of the component of the Dirac fields at all points of space-time. So here, X is a point in Minkowski space M13, let us say. This is Minkowski space. This is space-time. And A goes from 1 to 2 to the power d over 2, which is the dimension. This is Dirac indices. the component of the Dirac spinor. We introduce this psi bar, the conjugate, which is, let me write it, psi bar A of x, is the same thing. Okay? And instead of considering this Dirac field as ordinary, the component as ordinary complex number, we just consider that these are independent generators of a very big Grassmann algebra. You see, so each psi A of x plays a role of a theta. Okay? And each psi bar A of x plays a role of a theta bar. So instead of having, theta i's with I going from 1 to n, we have a psi A of x with A going from 1 to 4 in our case, and x belonging to Minkowski space. So we have a big Grassmann algebra which has an infinite dimension. The dimension of my algebra is 2 to the power 4 times the number of points in space-time, which is of course infinite. So this will require regularization, but it's a really, really very big Fock space, a big algebra. Okay? And then just define a path integral as a Grassmann-Gaussian integral that we write formally as d psi bar of exponential of I times our action for the Dirac field, where this is the measure. This measure is formally products from the A equal 1 to 4, products for all the points of space-time of d psi bar A of x, d psi A of x. So this is a bit formal. And this is a measure. And the action is just taken to be the Dirac action for the Dirac field. So S of psi bar psi is just what I wrote before, integral over d for x, psi bar of x, and let me write I gamma mu a b d mu minus m delta ab of psi b of x in component. Okay. See? So this is just the Dirac action. And now, formally, if you use those rules, well, you know that first, for instance, this will be equal in a formal sense to the determinant of this Dirac operator, I d slash minus m. the functional determinant, and that's something that will become very useful when coupling to a gauge field. So of course, this is a functional determinant. That has to be regularized to make sense. Then we know that if we compute the expectation value in this sense, using this functional integral of psi of x, psi bar of y, which should correspond, in fact, in the vacuum expectation value of a time-ordered product of the operator psi of x, psi bar of y in the vacuum, where those are the field operators in the second quantized theory. While the general rules of path integral should give us the same results, but we can check that we apply the fact that the expectation value of theta and theta bar is just the inverse of this operator, well, with the factor I, and what you find is that this is nothing. So this should be the same if we have equivalence between functional integral quantization and canonical quantization. But compute this using Bérézine calculus. What you find is simply the inverse of this operator, the Dirac operator. And if you do things carefully, what you find is that this is indeed, well, in Fourier transform, this is the Fourier transform of I because there is a factor I here. And then you have minus P slash minus M. And if you are careful about the fact that you can define this in the Euclidean, you get the correct contour prescription integration. So you get precisely the Feynman propagator of x minus y, Feynman propagator for the Dirac fermion. Okay? So, and we know also that now if we compute, so this is for the propagator. And finally, we know that if we are interested in computing the time order products of psi fields and psi bar field, we can compute them using this formula, and you will get, it will be given by Wick's theorem. So products of psi bar, products of pairs of psi and psi bar. Okay. So everything works fine. So basically, those path integral methods that I have defined in a bit abstract way, in fact, reproduces the rule of that were obtained by canonical quantization. But again, without dealing with creation and annihilation operator and commutation relation. They come automatically from the rules of what it means to integrate over anti-commuting variables. And of course, since we get the propagator, it has a correct singularity at the end. So we get, indeed, that expectation value of those field operator anti-commute. Therefore, even in, for point lag separated point, the propagator is not the same. So we get the Fermi-Dirac anti-commutation. Relation. So let me stop there. There is a subtle relation between psi bar here that I define here and which is in fact that the conjugate in the sense of Grassmann of psi is in fact psi bar times gamma naught. That's a bit of the subtlety that will be explained in my note, which correspond to exactly the relation to that in the Dirac theory, the complex conjugate of the field operator psi is not psi bar, but it's the complex conjugate of the field operator psi times gamma naught. So in fact, there is little subtleties in the Dirac theory of equation between what is called psi bar here and what is the complex conjugate of the phi operator in Dirac equation. And in fact, it can be, if one works a bit more carefully, one gets also this. Okay, thank you. Yes?
When you calculate that expectation value, that is not a number, right? That's a matrix.
Pardon?
Right in the corner of the board, that expectation value will give you a matrix, right?
Oh, of course. Well, this is a matrix because there is a p slash.
So you're implying that that's the inverse of.
So
when you write it like that.
Yes, you have to take the inverse. I thought you have seen that in the QFT1 course. Well, if you have not, it's simply that, of course, minus p slash plus m plus I epsilon plus is a matrix, so it has a matrix element A, B, Dirac matrix element. And when I mean 1 over minus p slash plus m plus I epsilon plus A, B, this is the inverse of this matrix AB as the Dirac case. See, since but now the indices are of our Grassmann variables are both the Dirac indices and X. This is both an inverse with respect to X's, so it's a kernel operator. And it's inverse, you have to take the inverse with respect to the Dirac indices. Okay. So this means when you go to Fourier space, momentum space, you can take the inverse because it's diagonal in Fourier space, but it's diagonal with respect to, this operator is diagonal in Fourier space with respect to the P, but it's not diagonal with respect to the Dirac indices. So you still have an inverse to perform, but it's an inverse of a 4x4 matrices, so you just use the Diracology relation between the Dirac relation to perform it. Okay? Okay, thank you.